You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. In 1845, two ships sailed into Baffin Bay. Last seen by whalers off the coast. And 3 years would pass without return. Without any messages or reports. And Victorian England began to grow fearful of what might have occurred. And so, expeditions were set. Provisions gathered and crews assembled. Many would search for these men, over land and by sea, but none could find Sir John and his crew. What some did discover, however, were strange horrors unimaginable to those back home. Stories of butchered corpses and boots filled with boiled human flesh. A madness that had befallen some of the men. The ultimate fate of each man is still unknown. And what happened, what overtook them, has been a subject of speculation amongst maritime scholars for years. Join us on Into the Portal as we attempt to unravel the doomed fate of the Franklin expedition.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
And we are back with the conclusion of our Franklin series.
Yes, we are indeed. Part 2 of the Franklin expedition. Before we jump right into it, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We wanted to, first things first, say welcome and a massive thank you to our new Patreon supporter, Jedge. And just a huge thank you to everybody over there on Patreon that supports the show. Our shout out to our producer, Tim. Everybody's amazing on there. If you guys haven't checked it out, go pop on over and take a look. We've got like 30 plus episodes for you guys to check out. And stay tuned for some new Patreon content coming really soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're pretty excited. We've got some new stickers coming too, hey?
Oh, yeah.
It's been kind of slow, though. Sorry, guys. There's delays all over the place. But
nature of the world as it is right now.
Yeah.
But we're pretty excited. Yeah, a couple cool new designs Amber's been working on. So, yeah, stay tuned for that.
Mm-hmm.
You ready to just jump right into this darkness?
I'm so ready.
Okay. So, if you guys, obviously, we encourage you to go listen to part 1 if you haven't already. But we'll do just a quick recap here. Essentially, we started off with the part 1 talking about the initial expedition. So Franklin left with 2 ships, 134 officers and men who were the best equipped possible for the times. They had woolen clothing that was seen to be the best fitted with felt outer coats, woolen mittens, all these types of things. And they were in extremely good spirits, fully expecting to be successful in their mission and to reach and map the remaining portion of the Northwest Passage and receive their rewards and all that stuff. We even mentioned in part 1 that there was a dove that allegedly landed on, I believe it was Erebus, right before they left. And it was just obviously an omen of, or not an omen, a sign of good things to come.
Yeah, almost like Noah and the Ark.
Exactly. So the 2 ships were last seen headed towards Lancaster Sound. And of course, we know that the occupants were never heard from again or seen again. But this is what we do know for sure. So we know definitely that they were amply provisioned. They were set up to last a pretty long time in the Arctic, 3 to 5 years, maybe even longer, with strict rationing of their tinned food supply. And there was no mention of distress amongst the Admiralty for a really, really long time because of how amply provisioned they were. And meanwhile, what was actually taking place on the ice for these first couple of years was obviously extremely grim and still unknown to some extent to this day. We do know that things were going pretty well, though. The first couple of months of the expedition were good. So the ships Erebus and Terror made their way through the ice of Baffin Bay, through Lancaster Sound, before they ended up hitting a little bit of trouble. They ran into thick ice in the Barrow Strait, and this is between Cornwallis Land and Somerset Island. So after hitting this wall of ice in the Barrow Strait, they decided to turn north. So they go north into the Wellington Channel for around 240 kilometers, where they run into a second wall of ice. And this is where things started to go wrong, I guess you might say. So this second wall of ice forced them to retreat along the west and south coasts of Cornwallis Island before they ended up settling into what would be their winter campsite on Beechey Island, which was a tiny piece of land laying off the southwest coast of Devon Island. And in part one, we discussed the ship's abilities, but despite these, they kept getting stuck. They had steam engines, but they weren't quite enough. So they ended up being subject to blizzards, freezing temperatures, gales of snow, and trying to keep hope alive that they could break through the ice eventually. So months later, after, suddenly caught in the ice again, September 1846, just off of King William Island, the waters froze completely overnight in a flash storm and locked both ships once again in the ice to the western side of King William Island. Probably the worst conditions you can imagine of the Victoria Strait, just unhospitable territory. And Franklin believed that the ships would be free during the summer of 47. So he was steadfast in this belief. They would still get out of this alive, even though they were locked in the ice off of King William Island. Instead, they remained frozen throughout the summer. Nothing thawed. And the men were forced to spend yet another winter off of King William Island. This is where the story gets dark, both because of the lack of knowledge of what actually happened, we don't really know, and also because of the remnants collected over time that would paint a picture of what we do know now, which was not very nice. So this was the perception back home as all this was going on as well. So there was a little bit of anxiety and fear as to the absence around the end of 1847. They left in 1845 because, of course, no word of their progress had come back because there's no way of sending any messages. But there was still no mention of a relief expedition at all. It was fully expected to not hear from them for a while, 2 years, maybe even 3 years, and Franklin himself, he made sure that his wife, Lady Jane, knew this, so she wouldn't worry if they didn't hear from them for 3 years. And the Admiralty certainly wasn't willing to, they didn't want to spend a bunch of money if they didn't have to. They were fully confident that he would make it back. Meanwhile, on the actual ships Erebus and Terror, in the same year, May 1847, there was a group of 8 men, 2 officers included in this group, who were sent out from the ships Erebus and Terror to King William Island. And we know this because of 2 notes written at different times left in a cairn that was discovered later on. So this was the first message that would be later discovered that painted an early picture of life on the ships. So this was dated from May 28th, 1847, and it reads as, HMS ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70:05 north, longitude 98:23 west. Having wintered in 1846-7 at Beechey Island, after having ascended Wellington Channel to latitude 77 degrees and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all is well. So we knew at this time everything was going relatively okay. And there was also a mention in the note that there was to be a foray to Cape Felix, the purpose to set up a magnetic observatory, which was part of Franklin's orders for the expedition, which fully suggested that everything was on track. They were secure, they were okay, they were healthy. Of course, there was a second note amended that painted a much different picture, almost exactly a year later. It reads as follows. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September, 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here at latitude 69:37:42 north, longitude 98:41 west. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men, and start on tomorrow, 26th, for Backfish River. And this was signed by Captain James Fitzjames of Erebus and also signed by Captain Crozier, senior officer from the Terror. And by 1848, Franklin and his crew had been gone officially for 3 years. While they had brought enough provisions, there wasn't exactly a lot of hope amongst Lady Jane, who was really pressing the government and the Admiralty to take action. And in many ways, what would result from the search would be essentially the greatest rescue operation in the history of time. And there was more than 30 expeditions over 2 decades that would search, and then many, many more after that as well. I mean, some of the information discovered was in the 80s. That's extremely important. But this is kind of where things kick off as men go searching for this lost expedition amongst the territory of the Northwest Passage, starting with 2 pretty famous guys here.
So it was by this point, we're reaching 3 years, we're in 1848, and this is when the first of many, many rescue and recovery operations, more so I would say, start to take place.
Yeah.
One of the first was led by James Clark Ross, who was the nephew of Franklin's friend John Ross,
Yes.
who had done his own expeditions in the decades previous. He is the one that was actually rescued on the northern by, what was it, whaling ships?
I believe it was, and he barely made it out alive.
Like a day away from starvation. So James Ross had been a successful explorer and had Arctic experience. However, his initial search was itself almost lost entirely.
Yeah.
It gave a real sense of what Franklin's crew was enduring or may have endured at this point. A lack of supplies and strange illness spread rampantly through his crew.
Yeah.
And John Ross nearly lost it all in search of Franklin. His ships actually drifted into the pack ice and were soon trapped in a sound.
Yeah.
So symptoms of his crew included melancholy, sluggishness. There was other odd neurological symptoms.
Yeah.
And it definitely seemed to be the case that scurvy was setting in. So they made it back, but in disgrace.
Yes.
This was unacceptable for everyone, including Lady Jane Franklin. And the most tragic part about all of this was in later missions, explorer John Ray's efforts would later reveal information that made this particular mission by Ross all that much more tragic in the scope of possible rescue opportunities, while Franklin's men still lived. Meanwhile, spring 1848, on board Terror and Erebus, scurvy and starvation were taking its toll, as was lead poisoning. They were getting thinner, weaker, more irresolute.
Right.
In the words of John Geiger, who has written several books on the topic, and it was just getting more desperate. Franklin was gone by this point. It was being led by Crozier.
And Fitzjames.
But the actual expedition was led by Crozier.
Right. Yeah. You know, and again, like the lead poisoning thing, we'll come back to that at the end because there's some sort of controversy and details with that. I can't even imagine what the initial thoughts were in 48. I mean, half the people trying to keep you propped up like Fitzjames and Crozier, but they know, I mean, they've done this before. And Crozier had been there before. Man.
Yeah, terrifying. So after the failure of Ross, John Ray was also sent on the tail. So he was one of the initial, it was one of 3 missions, and he was actually an overland explorer.
Right.
So he's actually credited by the Hudson's Bay Company Heritage Site as the last explorer sent by HBC to chart the northern lands in search of the Northwest Passage.
Yeah.
He was an explorer, a surgeon, an accomplished outdoorsman. The Canadian Encyclopedia describes him as born in 1813, raised in Orkney, and this is in Scotland.
Yes.
It was actually quite common. A lot of people that worked for HBC were actually from those islands, and they would come over, and a large population on the East Coast is actually from that chain of islands too, to this day.
Very cool. I know that.
So in Scotland, he learned a lot as a boy. It was a very sparse environment, which proved to be essential for his success as an Arctic explorer.
No doubt, yeah.
In 1846, prior to the calls to search for Franklin, he was actually chosen to undertake the final stage of surveying the Arctic coast. So he spent 15 months in the Arctic in his first sort of foray into these sort of, like northern adventures. And he largely lived off the land.
Yeah, you think you're good at camping.
Okay. This guy was pretty badass. And there was something about him that was different. It made him more successful than other white men. And this was a quote. It says here, this was from the HBC site as well. Ray made no secret of the fact that he preferred the company of the Inuit to his English colleagues, and he gained their respect and trust, things that would go far in his later searches for Franklin.
Yeah.
He actually adopted many customs of the Inuit. It was said that he actually preferred their igloo structures as opposed to their European type tents and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so, this was a very colorful character. He honestly deserves an episode in and of itself.
Totally.
But by 1848, it was apparent that Franklin and his men were lost. And Ray was chosen to co-lead one of 3 expeditions charting overland, while one of 2 others came from the east and the other came from the west of the Bering Strait.
I just want to say, too, I feel like it's very fitting that some of the first expeditions looking for them were overland, considering that Franklin's earliest expeditions were overland where he nearly died.
Yeah.
I just find that that just sort of just
fitting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So over the course of 3 journeys between 1848 and 1851, Ray and his partner Richardson were tasked with trying to find the wrecks, trying to find evidence of the men. They were largely unsuccessful, save for 2 pieces of wood that were suspected to be from either one of the ships or one of the sledges.
Right.
Wood is rare in this neck of the woods.
It was an area. It was an area without a lot of trees, and it didn't appear to be left by the Inuit per se, but they didn't really have any way of proving it, I guess.
That's true. They actually found these on the southern shore of Victoria Island. And like I said, they had no way of proving this. However, it was kind of the first inklings of the trail of evidence that was left behind.
Right.
And later on, Ray, he would go back. He would return several times. And later on, he actually would make more sinister discoveries after he successfully gained information from the local Inuit populations. Meanwhile, in August of 1850, Captain Rasmus Omni, and this is according to one of our favorite podcasts, the Morbid Curiosity podcast.
Yeah.
This captain actually found discarded food tins and scraps of clothing, as well as a cairn on Beechey Island. However, there was nothing in this man-made rock pile.
Yeah, it was sort of just, of course, and just so everyone knows, I think we mentioned in part 1, a cairn is a pile of anything, rocks, boulders, in some cases cans, like that we discover in this situation, were to leave a note, right?
Exactly. It's to kind of, obviously, it's like a symbol, right? It's like you can see it from a large distance.
Distinctly man-made, obviously, so you know that it was left for someone to go take a look at.
Usually stacked in a circular formation to form like a monolith.
Yeah.
I guess.
And this was sort of the first inkling of many weird things that when it came to written things left behind, either lack thereof or strange aspects to them. And so aids into our speculation later on, like, were they being removed? Were they being tampered with? It all plays into the speculation as to the degree of insanity amongst the men and who was doing what, when, and where.
Mm-hmm. What were their motives? What was the logic behind it? Was there any logic, essentially? But on this island, Beechey Island, like we referred to, there was this rock pile. There were these discarded tin provisions and evidence of advanced survival on the island. So evidence of a forge, so like an iron forge, to do metalwork, huts, other things like this. Already, there was some speculations that the food provisions might have been inadequately sealed. They might have been rotting. There was evidence of that. And the company who manufactured them, Goldner, adamantly denied this, obviously.
Yes.
And an independent audit actually discovered no other spoiled tins on other expeditions of that time.
Yeah.
However,
which was strange.
it is strange, but not without explanation. As history would have it, records proved that the provisions order for Franklin's expedition was rushed.
Yes, it was.
So this was a factor that could have led to poor quality seals, things that may not have been present during normal manufacturing conditions and normal production.
This was a new technology, so rushing something, even if you are really good at it, is one thing. Rushing it when you're just starting doing it, never really done it before. But that's still speculation, because how rushed was it? I mean, what does that really mean? If there was an audit of other tins, they might not have been rushed, but the process is still roughly the same. Obviously, tin or lead was used in this part of the seal. So it's like, that is known. We do know that.
Yes, exactly. Like the soldering aspect. So whether there was sloppy soldering or, in my mind, if they're rushing things, they might have just not have had the oversight, like the checking things over, right?
Potentially.
So things that could have been removed weren't. And then they, it could have been like almost like, I'm thinking back to when we were doing canning way back in our old job, like years ago, and you would have one spoiled can on a pallet, and literally that one spoiled can could like cascade and cause like ruptures and failures for the whole pallet.
Yeah, no, for sure. Lots of things could go wrong. It's just sort of crazy to think that so many things did go wrong, and it potentially started even before anyone boarded a ship. Like that's the part that's so insidious and crazy. It was doomed before they even signed up, some of them, potentially, if you believe in the lead thing. We'll come back to that. Actually, potentially a problem that other search expedition parties were running into as well, because you'd think that those would have also potentially been rushed in the search to say, hey, oh crap, we got to send out an expedition here in 1848. We're rushing some potentially tin provisions again.
If it was the tins that was doing it, like what if it was something to do with, because they did kind of allude to the idea that the lemon juice they had on board was deteriorating, so it wasn't as effective against scurvy and other sorts of things.
Yeah, good for the first few years, but started to lose its effectiveness, and they started to realize that pretty quickly, I think. And yeah, like I said, a lot of other rescue missions would encounter some similar strange things. So kind of around this time, 1850, there was actually American expeditions that would end up going in search of Franklin. And this was under essentially the funding of Henry Grinnell. And he would end up funding later expeditions as well. But they ran into all the same problems. They have woolen mittens and coats and things, and then they ran into extremely damp, cold conditions. Obviously, we know now that those are terrible materials to use in these types of weather. You are going to get hypothermia, pneumonia, these types of things. It's gonna advance tuberculosis and these types of diseases that men were experiencing. But these crews would experience some weird stuff. So like symptoms amongst the crew were unique and extremely strange for the time. So like melancholy wasn't extremely uncommon, but that was one of them. Craving animal fat was a new one that men were reporting, and that hadn't been experienced yet on any of the ships. They also reported having terrifying nightmares and the inability to sleep. They would close their eyes and just see the most horrific things. And pain was starting to creep up in old wounds, old breaks and bullet holes and whatever it may have been. And this was common amongst multiple different expeditions. So, for example, Henry George Richards, he reported weakness and extremely strange behavior amongst his search crew. Sir Edward Belcher, he ended up abandoning 4 of his 5 vessels that were stuck in the ice for 2 years during his search because of lack of food and resources and discontent amongst his men. Captain Richardson Collison ended up placing several of his officers and crew under arrest because they were losing their minds. He believed it to be scurvy. Captain Robert McClure, he stated that after 2 winters in the ice, his men started to go insane.
Yeah, after 2 winters locked in ice in very miserable conditions with not a lot going on, that's definitely Jack Torrington territory there.
Yeah.
Overlook Hotel.
Definitely. This was actually another note here I forgot to mention. Extremely gruesome. Obviously food and starvation was one of the main things, and every single one of these ships was infested with rats in their hulls, and they got to the point where disease-infested rats were dug up from the hull and butchered and cooked for meat.
Yummy.
And
well, that would have helped.
It would get even worse from there.
It would, yes. Let's go back to John Ray for a minute here. So, like we alluded to before, he went on several expeditions. And by this point, it had been about 9 years since the Franklin disappearance.
Yeah.
The men were actually officially declared dead on March 31st, 1854. In 1853 to 54, John Ray undertook his fourth and last Arctic journey, according to the Canadian Encyclopedia. This is where he hoped to uncover Franklin's fate and claim the 20,000-pound reward waiting back in Britain.
Big bucks at the time. Big bucks at the time.
So in October of 1854, he had a break in the decade-long case. Near Pelly Bay, on the eastern side of Boothia Peninsula, he met a solitary Inuit who gave him the first news of Franklin. Up until this point, we hadn't heard anything about their movements on King William Island.
Exactly. Yeah.
And John Ray successfully traded with Inuit and gained information. And the Inuit had artifacts from the ships, including silver plates, and these actually bared the crest of their owners. So that was where they could actually trace back the ownership to the Terror or Erebus.
Yeah. Do you remember what was on Franklin's crest?
Oh, it was...
The conger eels.
Right. I was going to say it was like a snake or something.
So he
or an
had the
eel.
conger eel symbol on like on the forks and spoons and plates, and Crozier would have had likewise, and Fitzjames. So these are the artifacts that would have been
Their family crest.
yeah.
Not so much for Fitzjames, though, hey? Because he was...
Very true.
Or it might have been fabricated for him, because he definitely had a murky upbringing that
He did.
a lot of his colleagues actually tried to preserve for him, right? They tried to help him for the most part because he was a bastard.
Right.
He was born out of wedlock. It was an affair. And they kind of go into details on the Terror, right? But anyways, that's kind of a side note.
He deserves, and again, he deserves his own biography as well. Fitzjames, Crozier, they're all pretty fascinating individuals on their own.
So after encountering Inuit that had information about the Franklin expedition, John Ray, he had to make the decision that would essentially haunt him for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
So he was told the story from Inuit that about 40 or so Englishmen 4 years previously had been seen traveling on foot near King William Island, having abandoned their ice-locked ships. So after hearing this news, Ray had to make the decision whether he was going to pursue this information and go to the site fully, or if he was going to go back to England and report back. And at this point, he knew there was several different operations that were not even close to finding any evidence or even in the vicinity of it.
Yeah.
So he decided that he was going to go back. He knew that he was kind of making not an easy decision by any means, but one that would ensure his survival. Because if they hadn't made this decision, it would have meant that him and his crew had to face another winter in the Arctic.
Yeah.
And they weren't really prepared for that. So essentially, he arrived in Britain in 1854, and he described the situation for Franklin's men as follows. And this was from the perspective of the Netsilik. Sorry, I am mispronouncing
The
that.
Netsilik is how they pronounced it,
Netsilik.
and the Terror, the or the AMC series that we watched, and that's, I mean, close enough.
It's incredibly hard to find these types of pronunciations. I actually tried to find them.
Phonetic pronunciations of Inuit language is definitely not our. We can hardly pronounce English words.
Okay, so this is the information that he received. This was a quote from his letter that he handed to the British Admiralty upon his arrival. Quote, "The officer in command of these unfortunates," referring to Franklin's men, "had bought from the Eskimo for his followers a small seal, being greatly in want of provisions. At that later period, the Eskimo found the dead bodies of all of this party on the ice near Back River, and that the Eskimo had helped themselves to the stores of the dead, taking gunpowder, silver, plates, whatever else they thought fit as appropriate." End quote. So the report went on to describe more observations that actually pointed to evidence that the earlier expeditions led by Ross and Below had actually been incredibly close in the spring of 1850. Some said even within a few miles to where the men were struggling on King William Island. So this was observations that were pitifully way too late, 4 years too late, unfortunately.
It's just imagine that for a second, like just that thought that they would be that these rescue parties were literally like just a short march away, just a couple of miles away, right there, like basically a stone's throw as far as the Arctic is concerned. And that is the most depressing thing ever, really.
Yeah. And could you imagine if they hadn't had those complicating factors of disease and like poor supplies as far as their clothing and warmth and all that type of thing, if they had been able to be more amply prepared, they might have actually saved them. They might have. It could have been another Ross situation, right? Where they were just on the very last cusp of survival and then they were picked up.
I mean, obviously the difficult thing with recovery and rescue and any of this stuff is like they're literally just getting sent into the same thing. It's not like you can be like, oh, we figured out a bunch of new stuff in 3 years. Here you go. Yeah. You know, everyone was just running into the same problems.
They were, yeah.
And yeah, that's one of the darkest things we've discovered in this research was that little fact right there, that they were that close. Mm-hmm. Crazy. There was another letter sent to the Admiralty from the Hudson's Bay, September 1st, 1854, and Ray added some additional descriptions with his encounter with the Inuit, and they conveyed a reality to him that was obviously extremely dark, as Amber just referenced, and like the account was sourced from an adult male that Ray described as extremely intelligent and he respected, and he met, he was a hunter, he was carrying a load of musk ox beef, and he was very cooperative with Ray, unlike others that he had come across during this time. And basically the account, after just having conversations with this Inuit fellow, was confirmation that in the spring of 1850, there was a group of Netzlik that came across them. So they definitively came across 40 or so quote-unquote white men traveling over the western shore right in that vicinity of King William Island. They had sledges and boats. And they ended up actually purchasing seal in exchange for supplies.
Yes. Exactly. This confirmed the initial report that he had received.
Right.
So, because he, like it's all these second, third-hand accounts, but this, again, helped solidify the validity of these reports. And
the quote was, there was an officer amongst this group described as a tall, stout, middle-aged man, who I'm thinking, I mean, it's probably Crozier is who I'm leaning towards, right? Yeah. And we do know that Crozier could speak the indigenous language.
A little bit, yeah.
And a few others could as well. Mm-hmm. They could get by. So that sort of seems like it would have been him. And later on that same spring, there were corpses discovered. So some 30 bodies and some graves, where they still had the energy to do that, were discovered on this piece of land, and 5 bodies on an island nearby. And the bodies discovered definitely painted a picture of what was kind of going on in these final days at this one particular site. So there were some in tents, some bodies were discovered under the boat that they had with them, the small boat, which had been turned over into a form of a shelter. Some of them lay scattered about in different directions, as if they were just starting to wander off towards what they thought was safety in some sort of paranoid delusion. I mean, what do you make of that? Like, just from what I've just read here before I continue on, like, do you have anything to say to that?
Well, it definitely sounds like it was a camp of desperation, and they were using what little means they had left at their disposal. There were other observations, though, that pointed to, again, the desperate nature of what was going on, and that included...
Yeah, that included, well, the most appalling of what was observed, of course, was the mutilation of many of the bodies found, and the contents of kettles, and in some instances even allegedly leather boots that were filled of cooked human flesh.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting. Like, I really liked the wording of the letter or the report, as it said, because again, right, how do you describe these types of conditions to something like the British, to Lady Jane, to the British Admiralty, to everyone involved in this society of high civilization? This is like their crowning achievements. Like, finding the Northwest Passage is theirs. It's, it's their God-given right.
Yeah.
And so he goes on to say, From the mutilated state of many of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen have been driven to the last dread alternative as a means of sustaining life. A few of the unfortunate men must have survived until the arrival of wildfowl, say until the end of May, as shots were heard and fresh bones and feathers of geese were noticed near the scene of a sad event.
Yeah, and I feel like now's an important time to remember. In part 1, we talked about Franklin's early expeditions and how he got the name "the man who ate his boots," and just how much more this evolved from that. And we're going to do like a Film Friday episode, part 3, on the AMC series The Terror. But one of the most profound lines from that series was from one of the members of the Admiralty before they leave, and he says, "There'll be nothing. There'll be nothing. You hear? You'll eat your shoes again. You'll eat worse." And they did.
Yes. Well, Franklin didn't. He was dead by that point.
Yeah, good for him. But his
Yeah.
men would.
Interestingly enough, right? That's another parallel to his earlier expeditions because he, again, was saved from that reputation of them eating each other. Unlike, it was thought that maybe some of his other men on the earlier expeditions had resorted to that.
Right. Yeah. These were a couple of the other observations made at this site that were noteworthy. There was an abundant stores of ammunition that had been emptied out of their containers by the local indigenous that came across it. A number of telescopes were discovered, broken watches and compasses. There were silver spoons and forks and other things like this discovered, including a plate engraved with Sir John Franklin's, with his family crest.
Insignia.
They came across mutilated bodies that we mentioned, and the reports from Inuit of men eating each other as they traveled is something that's different than just setting up camp and sort of like we're eating each other to survive. This was so much more, because it's like it's straddling that fine line between scurvy and lead poisoning and losing your mind and starving, but also having your wits about you enough to prepare and bring flesh with you as you travel. They were bringing their companions with them.
Mobile meals.
Meals.
Yes. I think a really important point to make at this time is that John Ray, a lot of these were not his observations.
Exactly.
So they were just disregarded by a lot of people, including the British public, Lady Jane. He was smeared for returning to England instead of verifying a lot of these claims.
Which is such a backhanded thing to say. It's like, hey, why didn't you stay out there for another full winter and make sure you verified it, buddy? It's like, well, because I would have frozen to death.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, obviously, secondhand, non-white reports is the major factor here. Were not to be trusted. They were. This is 1850. Everyone, right? Obviously, Indigenous peoples were seen by the British as savages, and they weren't to be believed necessarily.
Exactly, and because of the harshness of the conditions of the Arctic and the lack of means of survival, it was also seen as like they weren't opportunists, but again, right, like you take what you can from the land, and even things like, like we've already mentioned that the Inuit did take what they could from the bodies and the sites that were found because they had to. They weren't doing it just to be dicks. Like it's very brutal. So you just need to do what you got to do. And I don't mean eating your fellow countrymen, but again, right? Like when your mind starts to slip, things start to go wonky. It's easy to do. And obviously the Inuit have lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years in these conditions. So they know. That's why they have things like the Wendigo, and they have all these these characters, these stories, these tales to kind of like,
and things
the Idrak,
in the
exactly.
north, and sure.
And another important thing too is like, it's so unfortunate that these were seen as exactly not to be trusted because it was the only evidence and information they had, right? And there will be other things found later on, but at this point, basically that's all they got is reliance on Indigenous knowledge and history. And this next character that we have coming up here, Charles Francis Hall, an American who was born in Vermont in 1821, he almost exclusively relied on the Indigenous people. He lived with them for close to a decade, like intermittently. I don't think it was a full decade. It was on and off. But he really respected them, and he gained a lot of similar information that Ray had gathered previously. So again, this is just amalgamating these little bits, these little Hansel and Gretel like breadcrumbs, so to speak.
Yeah.
But essentially, yeah. So like I said before, Hall was an American, and he was funded by Henry Grinnell. So American businessman, philanthropist, and he was under the thumb of Lady Jane to a certain extent.
Big time.
Lady Jane, we haven't really discussed her too much so far, but she was very influential, obviously. She pitted the British and the Americans against each other to keep getting expeditions sent out. And partly she encouraged them by saying, well, you still have to lay claim to this Northwest Passage. Who's going to do that, American or British? She didn't really care about that, but she wanted people out there looking.
Yeah.
So that was her modus, and she was very effective with that. So
Yeah.
Henry Grinnell, we already mentioned him like about, 10, 15 minutes ago. And
He funded some stuff earlier, yeah.
Exactly, closer to 1850. But again, it continues on with Francis Hall. And so Hall sailed to Baffin Bay as a private citizen in 1860. So this is a little bit later on here. Yeah. And he was trying to gain more knowledge about the fates of Franklin's crew. So in 1864, Hall and 2 of his Inuit companions made their way to King William Island, where they found and collected a skeleton. This skeleton was actually later identified as the remains of Lieutenant Vescant, who was of the Erebus.
Yeah.
And they also had some interesting facts. So like Ray's reports, the Inuit told Hall of these stories of their people who had visited the ships as they remained stuck on the ice. So before they had left.
Yes.
This is interesting. So an Inuit man by the name of Kokliargnan, had silver spoons that were belonging to Crozier. And he said that they had been given to him from a man on the ship. So again, this is earlier than Ray's reports.
Yeah.
And his wife also had a silver case from the ship. And the 2 of them had actually visited the ships and had encountered what they called a great jovial commander who was thickly proportioned, bald and bespectacled, and had been very popular and well-liked by everyone on board, including the Inuit. However, that being said, they'd visited a few times. They were kind of keeping tabs on these ships as they were locked in the ice.
Right.
And last time they saw him, he appeared sick and lame. So that possibly could have been Franklin, right? Because they're on the ships. Great jovial commander. It very much fits the description of him, right? Well-liked. Definitely that would be the case.
Yep.
The idea of him being sick. So again, that kind of, if he was sick and died, that makes sense. So it was early. It was 1847 he died?
When he passed, June 47, I believe it was. So this, it all matches up. It sounds exactly like Franklin.
It does. And the years aren't precise. Some people have thought that they could have been talking about Ross's earlier expeditions that got locked in the ice about a decade before Franklin's. But a lot of it kind of, like I said before, the descriptions do fit Franklin more so than Ross.
Because Ross was not a portly, jovial commander.
No.
He was actually quite disliked by his crew, by all accounts. Story for another day.
Yeah. So Hall's account revealed the extent to which the Inuit were aware of the ships and their occupants. They carefully watched their presence on the ice in those fateful years. However, they were unable to save the men, at risk of perishing themselves in these harsh conditions. And they weren't actually asked to. None of their accounts say that they were asked to lead an expedition out. None of that, right? They weren't called upon. But in 1869, Hall sent word to his patron Grinnell, and in it he stated that his companions had been directed towards Melville Island after word had been sent that white men had been seen. So Hall described how the Inuit related to him that they had come across Crozier and a party of about 40 to 45 men on the western side of King William Island in 1848. And that year, again, give or take,
Right.
a little bit there.
Yeah.
So the party was carrying 2 sledges of supplies, and they had met up with 4 Inuit families just before reaching and camping at Cape Herschel. So in this letter, he described how the Inuit abandoned the men to their fates when he thought they could have saved them. Which in my mind, I'm kind of thinking this is speculation, but I think that was being a little generous in the abilities of the Inuit. But anyways.
Well, we said in part 1, this area of King William Island and many of these other areas in the north had been almost entirely abandoned by the Inuit. They were desolate. Caribou didn't go there. Learning to hunt seal takes years. The fact that some of the ship crewmen were able to hunt seal was a miraculous miracle. And that just goes to show how hard it is to live in this condition. So when you add 50 people that are all British and pretty much useless in the Arctic, yeah, it's not exactly going to prop up your chances of making it through the winter.
No.
So
definitely not. And they did camp nearby. It wasn't as if they were like not on good terms or anything. It was just a matter of like, you're here, we're all doing our thing, kind of whatever. The way that Hull describes it was that he says that they did, quote, secretly and hastily abandon Crozier and his party to suffer and die for need of fresh provisions. When in truth, it was in their power of the natives to save every last man alive. But that's his own speculation, I think. But the trail of evidence kind of just kept going from there. So there was the Cape Herschel skeletal evidence. Essentially, it just continued on. So there were more skeletons found along with the remnants of a camp along Pfeiffer River. The trail continued southeastwards towards the final resting places known as Desperation and Starvation Coves.
Aptly named.
Exactly. He discovered a lot of similar things. He was adding to the accounts. The picture was forming that clearly they had traced some sort of route south towards Back River, and that basically, they were just getting picked off like as the conditions took them.
Yeah. Dark stuff.
So we're going to take a quick promo break.
And be back with more terror.
Hey guys, we know it's not always easy to admit you need help with something, but that's why there are so many other alternatives to traditional therapy these days.
Yeah, we were really excited when BetterHelp approached us because we didn't even know that services like this existed. And it just makes it so easy and accessible to get help with your mental health, which is so important. You can access licensed professional counselors through BetterHelp basically any way you want to and on your own time in your own way.
Yes, this is professional help, not self-help. And these are people that can really help put a new perspective to your life. If there's things that are getting in the way of your happiness, your overall self-worth, or other negative thoughts and feelings, this is a great, great medium to help you lift you out of that.
Totally. Like it could be really anything, struggling to achieving your goals or whatever it might be. We really encourage you guys to check it out because there's something for everyone. There's a person for everyone to talk to kind of work through and be a better you and deal with mental health problems. So we encourage you guys to check it out. It's betterhelp.com/portal and you can use promo code PORTAL, PORTAL, to get 10% off your first month using the service. And we really, really hope you guys check it out.
Exactly. There is financial assistance for those who qualify. It's time to start living a better, healthier, happier life, guys. Come on, let's do it.
Yeah, so visit betterhelp.com today /portal and use promo code PORTAL for 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. And we're back. Okay, now we're kind of getting into a few things that I was pretty surprised to stumble across. I mean, in some sense, just because we knew what kind of darkness was taking place, but this was something so specific and earlier on that it really makes you wonder what the breakdown amongst the crews might have been. Because Hall would encounter an Inuit hunter who told him about some pretty interesting things.
Exactly. And like you said, Andrew, this has to have happened early on because it took place on an ice-locked ship.
Yeah. So as we were mentioning before the break, Hall was one of these explorers who ended up conversing with a lot of local indigenous members and stuff. And he spoke with one hunter who said, quote, he came across a great ship locked in the ice. The exact year that he came across the ship is unknown, but we do know that it was earlier on. He was welcomed aboard by the captain at the time, but later on, when he revisited the ship, he was accosted by the men. And he said that their faces, their hands, and their clothing were blackened. And he was essentially seized until the captain emerged and ordered him to be released and gave him a gift of reassurance that he wasn't going to be harmed in any other way any further. But he was warned not to approach one particular spot, a tent that was on the ice nearby that contained, quote, black-faced men who lived there. Now, what was causing exactly this? Darkening of the face, gums, eyes, could have been scurvy, or it could have been a combination of things.
It could have, because he did describe the faces, hands, and clothing. These were coal-powered ships.
True.
So that could have explained it. That's the most mundane explanation. Like we already said, there is no date known. We think this could have been Franklin's, one of his ships, Erebus or Terror. However, some people have actually thought that it was earlier. It was Ross's expeditions. But I have a little caveat to that.
Yeah.
If it was Ross's expeditions, he would have been able to explain that. Right? It wouldn't be just this one bereft little like mythic element of the search for Franklin that was never explained.
Exactly.
Right?
No, couldn't have been. Couldn't have been from him. There was researcher David Woodman who would later on look into this story in more detail in these accounts, and he thought that this situation pointed to a ship, basically, absent of any naval discipline, bereft of naval discipline, as he would say. And possibly at this time extremely short of officers and therefore in leadership on the ships. So it's possible that these scary black faces were a result of advanced scurvy and slowly losing their minds, and they ended up abandoning the ship. Another option that he suggested was pretty interesting. Could have been a group of men celebrating Guy Fawkes Day.
So maybe that could have been, if that was Ross's expedition, maybe it would just be explained as like, well, we never even thought to mention it because we were just celebrating and la la la.
But it's like you wouldn't
happened.
direct Inuit not to go there, though. You wouldn't say, don't go over there. That party's getting a little out of control.
Actually, that's a good point.
So that's a little bit ominous.
That is a good point. And just going back to just the specific here, so Woodman actually thought that it could have been a result of advanced scurvy, and that this particular episode happened after the initial abandonment of the ships. So this comes into play with other evidence that was found by a man that we're going to get into in just a second here, Francis Mcclintock, who discovered evidence that one of the sledges may have been heading back towards the ships.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then this paints a particularly dark picture, one where clearly there's a rift that's happened, there's separation, or perhaps these men had made their way back to the ship after abandoning those left on King William Island, the 30, 40 bodies that were found scattered throughout King William Island. What if these were the very, very last survivors and they were like, you know what, screw this, we're not going to Back River anymore. We're going back to the ships and we're just going to wait it out and then
hope it opens up. And if it doesn't, then at least you have shelter of the ship, I guess. But
yeah. So anyways, I really enjoyed this little story because this again helps paint a picture of the blackness, right? It creates a light where perhaps we're seeing just a tiny snippet of what was going on.
Yeah.
So let's get into Francis Mcclintock then. So he led later expeditions in the 50s, so 57 to 59. He co-led the Fox, and he co-led that with Lieutenant Hobson. And very late, he did this at the behest of Lady Jane Franklin, who basically refused to submit to the Admiralty's conclusion that after about a decade spent searching, the expedition had been tragically terminated. There was no other conclusion. Among their accomplishments in the Arctic was innovations in sledging. So obviously this was very primitive at the time of Franklin, but they innovated the idea of using staggered teams, placement of meals and supplies ahead of time. So you can it's almost like a relay.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more effective. And he actually had the addition of a map that was drawn by a local Netzlik person, which showed the positions of Victory Cairn, which was the cairn where the only letter that was like the official documentation of what had happened to the crews was found.
Yeah.
And he also placed one of the ships on that map too, where it had sunk off of King William Island. So was it Terror or Erebus?
Right.
So Mcclintock and his men successfully recovered the document left at Victory Cairn at the northern end of King William Island after the recovery of another cairn, which contained nothing but 2 broken bottles and a triangularly folded piece of blank paper, which Hobson actually thought was originally written in pencil but etched away due to weathering.
Yeah. I mean, I guess
What could that have contained, eh?
what 3 questions. One, what could it have contained? Was it written in pencil because they had nothing else, or was it written in pencil because they weren't thinking right at the time?
Or what if they thought they were writing and then they weren't? They had like a stick in their hand. They weren't actually writing anything. Just delusional.
That's possible.
I don't know. But after more days searching the northern side of King William Island, a smaller cairn was found, and then a much larger one. And this contained the all-important letter left from the crews of Erebus and Terror that we actually talked about at the top of the episode. So this is interesting because we didn't actually... we didn't talk about one element of this letter. So Hobson described his observations of this report, or whatever you want to call it, where he said that there was a mistake in the dates. So on that piece of paper, it said that they passed a winter at Beachy Island in 46-47. It was actually 45-46.
Right. That's
So
right.
again,
a full
right?
year earlier.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That was the first official note. And then it wasn't even amended later on by the subsequent note that was written by Crozier and Fitzjames. So again, right, that's kind of like, that's a weird thing to miss.
That's why this story, like what makes this story so bizarre, because all these search parties sent encountered a lot of the same stuff, but there was so many things like you're mentioning right now that were aspects of the Franklin that were different. And like they had already sent men back, right? They had already sent men back to, like they sent men back to the Orkney Islands, like when they, right at the beginning of their trip, there was some sickness, they sent them back, and then there was the bodies buried on Beachy, standard practice, but still to lose 3 in your first winter was a little bit ominous. That wasn't exactly normal.
And to lose so many officers, that was the main thing too.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that.
It's like it was cursed.
Yes, because that goes into the whole idea of lead poisoning and the tins. Okay, another really important observation that Hobson detected was that the actual writing on the note by Captain Crozier in particular, where he wrote, "And start tomorrow for Great Fish River," which was Back River. He wrote this in what was described as a weak, tremulous hand. And it inclined Hobson to the belief that he must have been in ill health in that early period.
Yeah.
So, Crozier, not looking good for you. Hobson actually went on to say that from the position assigned to the ships at the time of their abandonment, I concluded that if, as the Lord intended us, there was a wreck on the western coast of King William Island, it probably would be found at no great distance from us, as any ships drifting to the south from that position would probably be blank, which is illegible, up by the blank shoulder of the land, end quote. Yeah, so interesting, hey?
Yeah.
Another discovery they made was a recovery of a boat containing a body and supplies. There was other articles bearing the initials of officers aboard Erebus and Terror. And this boat was actually mounted on a sledge. And both of these were pointed to the northeast. So that was a strange orientation that Hobson remarked upon. He said the boat head was found pointing to the northeast as if she had been returning to the ships. Whether this is the case or whether she had been turned by accident or by her crew to afford them a better shelter from the wind, I have no means of judging. So this discovery of the northeastern oriented boat and sledge has led some to theorize that some or all of the party had in fact turned back towards the north. They might have been heading towards the ships. They might have been heading towards the same location that Ross and his men had been rescued from. But another option was that, like he said here, it was to maximize shelter and protection against the Arctic conditions.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I mean, like you just said, like going back potentially to the location of where Ross's earlier expeditions had been saved. I don't understand why that wasn't the plan altogether.
Right? I know.
Why was that not the original plan? They had 800 miles to go to Fort Resolution. They had like 600 miles or something crazy like that to go to the Backfish River. The distances they had to cover were just insane. And to think that that was a better option than trying to take your luck with, I mean, especially if you noticed at the time that what you were eating was causing some problems, you were almost better off taking a risk of waiting another winter. I think it was just the restlessness. they were almost better off waiting to see if the ships would free up. I mean, they obviously might have lost one by this point.
Yeah, because you never know. That was
because
really
one
sketchy.
ship got driven down, and then the other thing too is the locations of the ships wouldn't have changed all that much if they were frozen.
Well, no, because it's like an ice flow. It's like a glacier, right? Like the water, it keeps flowing.
But it's not like you'd lose them. It's not like you'd be hiking back and you wouldn't be able to find them.
Oh, no, I wouldn't move that fast.
Yeah.
Unless it went under.
I mean, this is just all of our speculation in 2020 with all this information. It's pretty easy to make these judgments, I guess. But there would be a few more things discovered that would be the most bizarre of all.
Yes.
And those being the Pegler Papers, or papers that would be sort of referred to that later on.
Yes. So this was a collection of personal papers that were discovered on a body that was found laying face down. Apparently death overtook him while he marched. The bones were bleached, but there was still a uniform on the body.
Right.
So these are the only personal papers ever recovered from the expedition, which makes them highly significant. And interestingly enough, like you said, these are referred to the Pegler Papers because the body was originally presumed to be that of Henry Pegler, who was captain of the foretop. And this was because of, it was a certificate found that was a seaman's narrative on the life of Pegler. So it was almost like his, memorial, but like his life journey.
Right.
On closer examination, it didn't really match up that it was the body of Pegler, though. It actually resembled that of a steward, the uniform did. It's a speculation, obviously, was rampant, but they thought it was a friend of Pegler's bringing his dead friend papers home. Some actually proposed it was Thomas Armitage, who was the carrier.
Right.
And these papers are interesting because, like we said, the only personal account. So what could have been on these pieces of paper, right? Like, what information did they hold?
Yeah. Pretty bizarre, because the initial thought was that these papers, when examined, were actually written partially in German due to the prevalence of words like Mecht, like M-E-H-T, K-N-I-H-T, like nicht, echt, like E-H-T, like the sounds and enunciations of like what was spelt like was distinctly
Night.
German.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it rectified under close examination. Obviously, this was not written in German. These were just randomly misspelled words spelled backwards, words almost entirely made up. The last letter of many of these words was capitalized rather than the first at the beginning of a sentence. And the speculation was sort of like, was this some sort of like a secret code to ensure the privacy of the writer, or was this just a result of the sickness of the mind and slowly losing touch with reality? Could it have been illiteracy? I mean, this is still 1850. I mean, potentially someone trying to document that was just a steward or a cabin boy or something. And much of the contents of these papers have been, they were discussed as irrelevant to the expedition, but they definitely paint a picture of some pretty bizarre things happening. I mean, what is your initial thought? Just like at the idea of words written backwards and letters capitalized at the end.
From what they could actually decipher, because a lot of it was illegible. There was a lot of damage to these papers. A lot of it was blotched out, all that kind of thing.
These phrases, some of these phrases are pretty interesting.
Exactly. So a lot of it was irrelevant. It seemed to be like talking about other experiences, their memories of like warmer climates, being a seaman, all this kind of thing. However, there were the other passages that did contain clues to life spent on the ships. Things such as breakfast to be short rations, breakfast spelled wrong without an A, whose is this coffee, and the terror camp clear. Those were three phrases found in these papers.
The terror camp clear being the most significant.
Well, one of the most significant. There was another intriguing passage that had reference to life on the ships just prior to their abandonment. So that was probably and this is kind of hard to read because it's very poor English, and again, kind of makes me think it wasn't a secret code. It was more so illiteracy. He's trying to get the message out and doesn't know how to spell words. That's kind of sad. It's like a 5-year-old trying to write a letter, right?
You want to read this?
Okay.
Or do you want me to give it a go?
Yeah, I think you should give it a go.
So this is, goes as follows. We will have his new boots in the middle watch, as we have got some very hard ground to heave. Shall want some grog to wet our whistle.
And that's spelled Hour is spelled with an Houer, and then whistle is spelled Wissel.
Right.
So very poor spelling.
All my art, Tom, for I don't think for now closes, should lay, and first men 21st night agreed.
So the new boots referred to were assumed to be boots such as those found by Mcclintock and other searchers, which had been modified with the addition of nails or cleats to make them more suitable for the Arctic ice.
Right.
There were also references to the hard ground to heave, which could have been referring to either hauling sledges or maybe digging graves. And there was also the reference to the 21st night agreed, which was described as the most tempting of all. Could this have been the 21st of April in 1848, 4 days before the amended record left near Victory Point? So that's interesting to me.
I feel like that's most likely. Like everyone's deliberating on what to do.
Yeah, they don't know. And obviously this is very partial. And like, if only we could have had more of like a full, like imagine if we did manage to find, what's his name?
Fitzjames Crozier.
Fitzjames, yeah. Because he was the one that was the most colorful in his descriptions. And if we could find those.
We just might.
Well, we just might. Unfortunately, a lot of those papers, diaries, journals were actually given to, well, they were found by indigenous people, right? Like the Inuit, and they were given, because they didn't have any worth for them, they gave them to their children to play with. So a lot of those records were just ultimately destroyed by kids playing and having fun, which, you know, all on them, but that's really sad at the same time.
Yep. That's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting factor, or I guess just fact of reality at that time, was the inaccuracy of the maps. And we actually talked about, not too in depth, we talked about the magnetic aims of the expedition.
Yeah.
And how they were trying to find magnetic north, or trying to weed out the influences of magnetic north on their actual mapping.
Yeah.
Because it was messing with everything. And this is really scary. So, to me at least, when we started looking into this, the Admiralty, when they're going and setting up all these rescue operations, they don't know what route he took at all.
No.
There's no like flight plan, like, you know, like they do for planes, or like a ship's logbook, like, you know, like your record of whatever, and you submit it before you go.
Right.
Like your route plan
your
or whatever.
projected route.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You have no way of saying because of the ice and because of whatever else.
Exactly. And so there was considerable guesswork in the position of the ships. Many supposed that they would have taken a similar tack to Ross's men, right? So going north and getting picked up by whalers or any sort of ship passing by. And so that was kind of where they focused, as well as the overland. So in my mind, I'm like, this is just horrible. Like, how bad of a plan is this, right?
I mean, it's like, it seems, I mean, it's so easy for us to say that now, right? But it's
True.
like you're, if you don't know what's there, you can't plan. And so what do? It's like you either don't explore or you fly blind. Those are the two options.
True.
And that's what they had to deal with.
And I guess they were confident in the fact that basically all they had left to map was like a 500-kilometer stretch. It was a particular strait. It was the Barrow Strait.
Right.
That was all that was left supposedly for them. But again, like you said, like everything's changing. The ice melts, the ice refreezes, it's locked for years, sometimes it's not, all this stuff. And then added to that was the idea that King William Island was thought of as King William Land.
That's right.
They didn't even think they could go east.
No, they thought that there was maybe a sheltering bay on the sort of north coast of it, but that it wasn't an island, that it was. Mm-hmm. I do want to point out too, I don't actually remember if we brought this up in part one, but kind of going along the lines of like doomed from the beginning. And we're talking about how you get locked in the ice, you can't predict it, you get stuck, you have to change your course, all this stuff. When the modern search for the ships was taking place in 2014, which we'll cover eventually, they basically, like in one article I was looking at, it basically said like Franklin's ships met the most warmest temperatures, like unprecedented warm temperatures in the last 100 years leading up to 1845 for them to actually get into the position where they ended up locked in the ice.
Right.
They most likely wouldn't have died. They would have been blocked much, much earlier and just not have been able to map anymore. All the conditions for this were perfect, from the rush of the tin food to the weather being unprecedentedly warm, which plays into the whole idea of earlier on, people genuinely believed that the Arctic was warm. They thought you could make it through a bunch of ice, and then in the north, there would be a warm sea waiting for you after you ventured all the way through. It's like a reward for suffering through the cold.
Yeah.
And the irony of that is just scathing to me.
It really is, and it's so unfortunate. And all these false illusions, all of these notions that were fancifully playing in Franklin's head, and in even after and before that, right? It's hard to imagine. So in all, there was over 30 rescue expeditions sent in the wake of Franklin's disappearance.
Yeah.
Efforts that spanned decades, centuries, even 3 centuries now. And these were mostly fruitless in finding the actual ships themselves, instead finding these scattered remnants of the men and their supplies. By 1880, the British Crown had handed off the territories of the North to Canada, as well as their efforts to map this Northwest Passage.
Yeah.
And the mystery of Franklin and his men faded into obscurity for the most part. There were a few different expeditions. I think one was in 1919, there was one in the 40s, and then in the 80s, there was a search mission led by Canadian anthropologist Owen Beatty, who discovered remains on King William Island that confirmed previous testimony of the Inuit in regards to cannibalism.
Yeah.
There were cut marks that clearly showed, like severed bones of arms and legs that formed the conclusion that the men had resorted to hacking apart the dead in order to carry and create mobile food sources that could be consumed along the way. Interestingly enough, Beatty is co-author of the book Frozen in Time, The Fate of the Franklin Expedition, which he co-authored with John Geiger. And John Geiger's, we've referenced his research quite heavily in this episode and in part 1, too.
Yep.
Definitely recommend checking out his research. So this, again, it rectified the character of John Ray and of even just of the Inuit themselves, right? They were telling the truth. It wasn't as if they were lying.
Why would they?
Exactly.
I mean, what would they have to gain from that?
Nothing.
You know?
And so everything kind of just, there was a lot of different rumors. There was a lot of different, not rumors, I would say, but a lot of different theories floating around as to, now that there's more skeletal evidence and more modern evidence, there was more increasing speculation as to how much lead poisoning affected the crew. What were the causes of morbidity and mortality? I actually had to look up both of those. Well, not both of those, but I had to look up morbidity versus mortality because I was like, what are we talking about?
Right.
So it's literally just the difference between morbidity is disease and obviously mortality is death.
Of course. And I mean, amongst those two things, there were various different options as to what could have contributed. I mean, we've mentioned scurvy, obviously lead poisoning, but also tuberculosis, potentially zinc deficiencies were issues as well, botulism. And, not that seasonal affected disorder would have been particularly scary considering the other things, but not having vitamin D and living in the Arctic for years on end would probably affect you pretty heavily as well. Scurvy, though, being one of the most the most insidious of any of these. And when thinking back to the black face, black teeth, the tent of men that were where the Inuit were warned not to approach them, matches up with a lot of this. So swollen and spongy purplish gums that are prone to bleeding and losing teeth, bulging eyes, bleeding on the skin, easily bruised skin, very, very dry hair that can break off, and wounds that just don't seem to heal. And I think that would be the most scary and ominous out of any of those symptoms, being in the Arctic, especially as a sailor. I mean, people were hurt all the time. You had to get people had to have limbs amputated and whatever it may have been.
Oh yeah, for like things like frostbite or whatever.
Exactly.
But if you're rotting from the inside out, that's pretty nefarious. Like I'd be pretty scared.
And of course, the lead poisoning aspect is almost entirely speculated upon because of the bodies buried at Beachy, which were extremely well preserved because of the temperature.
They're mummified.
They're mummified, yeah.
The dry conditions, too.
They did have up to 20 times the normal amount of lead in their system and at the time. And this was, John Torrington, 1984, and anthropologist at Amber just mentioned, Dr. Owen Beatty, make reference to this. But they were buried in graves. They were buried, in a ceremony.
They had beautiful graves.
And,
they were highly decorated, like the actual tombstones.
So it's just sort of weird to think that, Franklin was giving a eulogy and you're burying these men and you don't know really. They were thought to have died from pneumonia.
Yes. And that's where we start to get into these complicating factors, right? Where it's like, it's a combination of things. It's a combination of scurvy, potential lead poisoning, weakening the body to the extent that things like tuberculosis and pneumonia can take over. And it all works together. And I loved this quote from John Geiger's book. This quote here is from page 93 of his book. He says, "Lead poisoning has insidious effects on both mind and body. In body, even tiny amounts can cause fatigue, digestive upset, headaches, and joint pains. Lead is a potent neurotoxin, leading to memory loss, mood disorder, paranoia, pain, tingling, and numbness in extremities, and general mental breakdown." So he asked the question, could this have been a contributing factor to the decisions that were made? And
Right.
I would say probably. If you can't remember something, you're going to start to lose your mind, right? Like, even like you made the good point of saying, like, well, what if something happened, and then you forget 10 seconds later, and then someone turns to you to, follow up on what had just happened. You just have no idea what's going on.
Right. Maybe
That's why they totally blanked on the idea of going to where Ross's men had been rescued.
That makes sense. But then the only argument against that, I guess, is the speculation that would sort of come out a little bit later on, that there wasn't necessarily clear-cut evidence that all of the men were experiencing the same symptoms, or that lead poisoning would have advanced as much as it did. Like, there may have only been some of the provisions that resulted in contamination, even if they were rushed.
Well, even because we did allude to Goldner's Meats as the source company for all of the tinned food that was brought with them. And apparently there was one article that claimed that the British Admiralty was aware of these claims of, spoiled foods and these inadequate seals by 1852. So again, that's 7 years after they left. Yeah. There was a History Today article that claimed that the documentation of the original contract at Deptford in April of 1845 revealed that the order for the tins was rushed, strengthening the view that a significant portion of the expedition's supply was contaminated. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was those cans we talked about on Beechy Island. They revealed incomplete soldering of the lead. And so the seams on the sides of the cans were essentially destroyed. It also, I put this note in here too, it makes sense that they lost a disproportionate amount of officers so early on because these were actually considered luxury items at the time.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So they would have been eating more of them. Yeah. Even though in my mind I'm like, I would have given, that's like dog food, man. Give that to the
Yeah, well, I mean, of course they had dried meats. They butchered oxen in the early years of their trip, and then the tin provisions were supposed to be the saving grace. They were supposed to be the 3 to 7 years. Like we said up to 5. Like they could have rationed up to 7 if things kept.
And the notes, the papers, the Pegler Papers did allude to that, strict rationing for breakfast.
Right.
Sentence there.
Oh, man.
It's kind of insane to think. I liked this. This is from an author that was published in History Today, 1987. And her name's Sheila Rowbotham. Wow, that's quite the last name. But she said, quote, "Insidious ingestion of lead weakened its members to a point where tuberculosis and pneumonia wrought havoc, conditions identified by the postmortems on Beechy Island bodies. Anorexia, weakness, and paranoia would have compounded the effects of starvation and scurvy, leading to the final horrors of cannibalism."
There's so many questions I have still, and we always will have them, obviously, when it comes to timeline factors. And like I'm ready to jump into some theories if you are, because with you reading that quote there, I mean, clearly it's very likely that, I mean, the tins were contaminated. We do know this to some extent. Like, there was lead in the bodies at Beachy, these types of things. But if there was enough lead in the bodies found at Beachy to be in really advancing some of these early onset diseases that people would get in the Arctic, it seems strange to me that that would happen. You'd bury 3 bodies there, that those 3 bodies, 2 of them being officers, I believe, or at least 1 being an officer, in good health when they left, and then continuing on for the next year and leaving a report that things are pretty okay. You know, that you're still setting up your magnetic observatory stuff. There's a forge on King on different spots along the way. You know, like the report from Fitzjames was things were fine early on, and like, so you'd think that like if 3 were so far advanced that others would have been too. There might have been some inkling that, hey, maybe we need to think about this. And was it just Franklin and him being like, hell no, we need to get through the passage. I'm just going to block all that out of my mind because I need to redeem myself.
And just to kind of add to that was the idea that they were supposedly presumed dead of pneumonia. So what was their perception of disease on the ships? What was it? Like, were they looking at the symptoms or were they looking at the causes, right? Because like I just said, like it would, the most prominent symptoms would have been aches, pains, like, you know, like things like memory loss, sure. But
and that's what I'm saying.
Things like pneumonia would have been attributed to the weather. It wouldn't have been attributed to the weakening of the body because of other nefarious sort of things.
For sure. But if those who ended up with pneumonia because of being weakened from other things, you'd think that some other people would be like, man, my joints are really sore. I don't have pneumonia, but I am sore and I'm tired. I am having nightmares when I sleep. This is weird.
How much of that would you personally attribute to your foreign environment, to the cold, to the length, the duration in those conditions? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How much of it would you just like...
Totally, 100%. The only, I guess, rebuttal to that I would have is like, these were crews made up of hardened seamen and like that had been out there before, not necessarily in the Arctic, but some of them definitely had, and the rest were Marines. They had fought in the you know, in the Battle of Trafalgar and different things like this. Like, they were hardened men that had been through rough, had seen scurvy before, seen disease on ships before.
Hardened men complain?
Very good point. Very good point.
And just going back to this overall point on the lead poisoning, there have been recent studies that kind of not contradict, but they've taken issue with lead poisoning as the primary cause of disaster amongst Franklin's men. There was this one from 2016. It was called The Health of 9 Royal Navy Arctic Crews from 1848 to 1854 and Implications for the Lost Franklin Expedition. So they actually did a cross comparison of the search ships, sick book, so all the resulting search people. So they tried to compare the conditions of the morbidity and mortality amongst those crews. So what they found was that there was no clear evidence of lead poisoning, despite the relatively high level of lead exposure that was inevitable on ships at that time, as they describe. There was no significant difference between the deaths of non-officer ranks of Franklin's ships and several of the search ships. So,
see, that's strange. I find that to be strange.
There's no significant difference between the deaths of non-officer ranks on Franklin's ships and several of the search ships.
Oh,
so
I guess
basically
that,
saying
like,
they're paralleling each other. There was no
and because the
real
officers were
discrepancy.
eating the same things.
Yes, so that was interesting to me. So they were basically, they thought that the greater numbers of deaths amongst the officers on Franklin's ships were probably a result of non-medical factors, such as accidents and injury sustained while hunting and during exploration, which could be, that is plausible in my opinion.
I mean, we'll find out more if we can ever find any additional documents, potentially from the ships discovered, if they can be, if they're preserved in any way.
Yeah. There was another study here actually from 2017 that was a critical assessment of the oral condition of the crew on Franklin's expedition. So this was assessing the theory that the crew was suffering from scurvy or lead poisoning. And they kind of put forth an alternative notion that oral conditions, including these blackened, dried, hardened mouths were described, could have been a result of miliary tuberculosis. miliary TB is something that in my mind I'm thinking, okay, that could have been onset by these complicating factors. But TB, this type of TB is actually characterized by a wide dissemination in the human body and by these tiny lesions that form. So their appearance could have been drastically changed.
Very true.
Yeah.
The reason I sort of got confused on that last quote you reread for me there was just like the idea that like the way that was phrased with the percentage of lead in the bodies like sort of sounds as if in one breath it's almost saying that like there was all ships at that time had lead, like whether it was the water, piping, whatever, right?
Well, exactly.
So it's like it was very likely that the tin provisions were contaminated, but at the same time we're sort of making a bit of a leap potentially because we know that there was lead in these people's systems.
And we don't have the sick books from those ships. We have not recovered those. And
that's why it's like it makes me feel like there's something, and I'm not going to jump in and I almost want there to be a paranormal element, but it's like but at the same time it's like there's got to be stuff we don't know. There has to be, because it's like people had been exploring before. People had been running into these issues before, dealing with scurvy. You've got lemon juice with you. It's 3 years in. Maybe it starts to slowly lose its effectiveness, but would scurvy be advancing that quickly at that time? Potentially, maybe not. I don't know.
You have so much supplies too. Like, I guess there was just very scarce to come across Inuit that you could trade seal for that would give you the necessary vitamins so you wouldn't get scurvy.
Right.
And get your own food.
And they allegedly hunted, exactly. They hunted seal themselves, which of course has vitamin C.
There was another thing that I didn't include, another article that I briefly looked at in the early stages of this lead poisoning research. And they were talking about how they had done a cross-comparative study similar to the one I mentioned, where they were comparing the sick books from subsequent like search missions. But this was like looking at a particular seaman's cemetery, and the location escapes me at this moment, but it was the same time period. And so they did a cross comparison between those bodies, the bodies at Beachy, and then other skeletal evidence that had been found later on King William Island and so forth. And they actually didn't find they didn't find an elevated lead that would suggest that there was that was an extreme factor involved.
Right.
So I feel like because we don't know what happened, really, we rely on lead poisoning as this, the properties of a neurotoxin, a general mental breakdown. This has to explain why they were never rescued, why they made these poor decisions. If you want to call them poor decisions, I don't know. What would you like?
Yeah, just strange decisions, I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess it's sort of redundant, even if it was lead or whatever it was. Regardless, it's like clearly the men were slowly losing their minds, and this is where I feel like a combination of that with potentially what you might call quote unquote like paranormal factors, or at least for them at the time factors they couldn't understand. So, for example, the magnetism research and aspects like that. There was some speculation on the sort of conspiracy theory side of this that might have been something they ran into as far as they became disoriented. They didn't really know where they were going. They thought they may have been going in the right direction, and maybe that's why that boat was turned around. Like their compasses may have not been working properly.
That makes sense.
They think they're going south for a certain period of time, and then you realize you're going dead east, and you're like, what the hell are we doing?
Oh yeah, what if you get caught in a blizzard, right? You don't know which direction to go.
So I mean, that's not paranormal per se, but if you sit there and you're looking at your compass spinning around and you have no idea where you are, and you wouldn't know why you wouldn't know why that's happening. The other thing I think is important to point out is like, this is desolate land. So for the men's perspective, there's no caribou to hunt. There's very little seal. There's very little whatever. On the flip side, the same goes for everything else that's potentially in this area. And a group of weakened, slow-moving food would be the perfect target for something. I don't know what that would be, because polar bears were definitely not prevalent in this area. They were there once in a while, but they weren't common. Wolves weren't really around because there's nothing for them to eat.
True.
This is where the speculation of the AMC series really comes in, because we haven't found enough bodies to make speculation as to what happened to everyone. We've only found some. We know some were cannibalized. We know some probably just straight up froze or drowned or whatever.
Yeah, they're probably still locked in the ice.
Yeah. But the rest, I mean, if they're hungry, if there's anything else out there, you can safe bet that it's pretty hungry too.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make. And if you did happen to stumble across something, what if you were trying to hunt something and then it just went terribly wrong for you because you are so severely weakened and your mental capacity is just not what it should be?
What if the men started even hallucinating to the extent where it wasn't even like cannibalism, like decided cannibalism? It was like they began hunting each other as if they were hunting something that's not even a man.
Oh, man.
Like, I mean, and that's the reason why maybe one of the boats turned back. They're like, these guys are starting to lose it. We need to go a different direction.
Perhaps, yeah. None of that's all pure speculation, and none of those bodies evidenced had signs of like murder per se. They had been dismembered, but that was post-mortem. So like they probably died of disease. They just succumbed to whatever, and then they were consumed by the remaining survivors.
That's also, but to that point as well, though, it's like you can, the cuts on the parts that were consumed were made post-mortem. The actual death of the individual, like examining the cranium or anything like that, we don't know if it was post-mortem. We don't know if they weren't murdered.
I've got an interesting point to make on that note too. I didn't include this in our notes, but in the course of research for this episode, I did come across multiple statements that talked about, they discussed how many of the bodies found on King William Island actually had no heads. Many have actually thought that, similar to the arms and legs, they were consuming aspects of the craniums, including the brains.
Lots of nutrients.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, that fully makes sense. I just think like if you are transporting the severed heads of your deceased companions to eat the brains, if you're hungry enough and they're not dead yet, I think if you're willing to do that moments after their death, you might be willing to edge it along.
True. And we did see aspects of that in the Terror where people were murdered in the later stages when they were succumbing to disease. And
this all comes down to the breakdown of command, like who's in charge. And then just the basically like no, like you don't care anymore. Like there's like the morality's out the window. Anything else is out the window. It's almost like the way I picture it. Like you can't really empathize or put yourself in that situation. But I try to imagine what it would be like. It would basically just be a blur, like a dream, like a nightmare. Like it's not even happening.
Sorry, one other thing I forgot to mention about the heads, because you were talking about, what if they could have possibly murdered some people too. The missing heads. Obviously, you can kill someone by hitting them on the head. So if their head's missing, you don't know the cause of death. So ergo, yeah, True. Always a possibility. Or just a difference of opinion too. It's life and death. And if you know what I mean? If you don't have that leadership, you don't have that unity, then things start to crumble.
Yeah. So it's fun to speculate on despite the horrific nature that this is a true story.
Well, it's just, it's fascinating. It's morbid curiosity, right?
It really is. It really is. And I think I'm down to the wire here, down to the end. I have no real theories other than the stuff we've kind of just peppered in throughout, like more questions, right? They're not theories, they're questions. Like, why not go to the spot Ross and his men were rescued? To what extent were you losing your minds? And each individual would have a different perception of the horrors around them as you're slowly losing your mind. It's not like you're collectively as a group just at the same process.
Exactly. You're not on the same page.
Yeah, that's what's terrifying.
Yeah. No, I have no real conclusions. I'm just really, really excited to see more of what comes of the excavations of the two wrecks. So, yeah, they were both discovered in the last decade.
Yep.
So it was 2014. It was a Parks Canada co-led with, I think it was the Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard.
Something like that, yeah.
And a couple of other universities, I think, too. They actually found Erebus in 2014.
Yeah.
And then they found 2 years later in 2016, the Terror slightly to the north. And they are still in the process of excavating. And it's insane. I just saw an article published this year, just a couple of, I think it was a month or two ago. And it's talking about how they are just entering the ships. All they've done in the last 6 years since they found Erebus has been documenting everything. They're surveying, they're not touching anything. It's all just leave in situ, so in place. Don't disturb it, and then they're going to start peeling away the layers. And could you just imagine, this is your entire life's work, being one of these researchers or being part of these crews, and John Geiger had a chance to be involved in that too. And he was on the ship. I don't think he was there when they found it, but he definitely was involved to a degree.
Really cool.
But it's just amazing to think, okay, so you find it, and then 6 years later, you haven't even really like cracked into it. You know what
Crazy.
I mean?
And some of the early images from the inside, now that they're going to be starting to do some actual excavation, is of like, full bottles of liquor still left in there, plates and cutlery and these types of things still left behind. And this sort of reminds me of something we forgot to mention too, that plays into the sort of like the idea of just Victorian England. And it definitely speaks to the mindset of the men when they first left the ships, because we know that some of the sledges they were pulling had stuff in them that they really didn't need. And that
slippers
to me, like slippers, plates, like heavy things, like nice china plates and cutlery. It's like, you can't just bring one fork and knife each that you keep in your back pocket. You don't need to bring a freaking full set of plates, cups, cutlery. You're lugging all this stuff that you can't eat. And to me, that speaks to, they were very much of sound mind, at least Crozier and some of those in command when they first left, because they said, you know what, we still need to keep some civility about us here. We need our Victorian finer things with us as we trek through the Arctic.
That makes sense, actually.
But then at the same time,
comforts of home, yeah.
Comforts of home. But then so much at the same time speaks to the fact that they wouldn't have been thinking those things. So it's almost like maybe it was the delusion that made them bring that out. We're going to be fine. It's going to be a quick hike. Let's bring the plates with us because we don't want to forget those. Bizarre. Absolutely bizarre.
The amount of effort and energy that was expended on carrying all of that equipment is astounding, in my opinion.
And of course, in the end, they all perished in ways that we won't ever know for some of them. And we want to know what you guys think about the search and this whole story, and sort of like what it kind of brought up, what thoughts came to mind for you when you were listening to this. Because like for us, for me, like this was one of the, I don't know, like we tried to convey it as best we could, but like for me, this was one of the darkest stories I've ever looked at. And to me, it's like, I mean, it's very similar in a lot of ways to like Dyatlov Pass, almost-esque.
In terms of the tragedy.
In terms of the tragedy and obviously the cold and things like this. And the lack of knowing. Obviously, there's more lack of knowing on that side. But it brought a tear to my eye, really. Like, especially like the spot where it was like in 1850, they were freaking 2 miles away.
A few miles, yeah.
That's just horrifically depressing.
It's cringeworthy. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, like we said, we want to know what you guys think of all this. What your favorite theories are, and just again, right? Like I can't wait to see what they uncover, and I'm going to be keeping my eyes on that mission, that excavation. They have some things working for them and some things working against them. Obviously, these really harsh Arctic conditions, and they're still struggling against the ice. They've got, what was it, like 40,000 horsepower icebreakers?
More than that, even some of them, right?
Yeah, and they're still struggling with that. There's days where they can't dive at all because of the weather. It's a very short summer season. They're actually able to do excavations, so that's probably why it's taking so long, right? Yeah. And then I just keep thinking of the gems that could be hidden in there, like Fitzjames's papers. One thing working for them is the fact that because it is so cold, the waters themselves are great at preserving things.
For sure.
They're not moving around too much. They're just settled. The ship itself, like none of the masts, or at least on Erebus, none of the masts are up anymore, but it's mostly intact. So it's a prize.
Yeah.
It's a real gem of a find.
And we're going to cover that as a little bit of a bonus. And I think the wildest thing about it is that Erebus was discovered in extremely shallow water. Like
you
30
can
feet,
see it,
not even. Like
I think it was 11 meters under the water.
Yeah, so like 30 feet.
Yeah.
And
just off of King William Island in that little, I think they call it Erebus Bay now. I could be wrong.
To think of over 170 years of not knowing, and it was just a few feet beneath the surface.
Yeah.
Wild. Well, you guys, thank you so much for listening to this part 2 of our Franklin Expedition series.
Yeah, we've got to thank our Patreon supporters, our producer Tim Godby.
Yes, sir.
Our regular sponsors of the show too. We've got Audible and BetterHelp, and all of you lovely listeners. So thank you for listening. And I guess until next time on Into the Portal.
Your gateway to the bizarre. This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.